One of the great things about living in Sarasota are the beaches. However, they may be threatened by what's going on in the Gulf. We're visiting Mote Marine today to talk to Dr. Rich Pierce to find out what is going on and what, if anything, we can do to help. Hey, this is Jaszy with ModernHippieMag.com, your online source for hip, healthy, conscious green living. Let's learn a little bit more about what's going on in the Gulf.
Senior Scientist and Director of the Center for Ecotoxicology.
That's a mouthful.
My area of expertise is chemical oceanography, focusing on the fate and the effect of toxic chemicals and how they impact marine life. So I'm a marine chemist / toxicologist.
What happened in the Gulf, it's been going on for so long. So many people are just depressed about it. Can you give us some insight from how you've been involved in the situation, how it's going?
Yes, Mote Marine Laboratory was one of the first responders when we realized that the oil could indeed impact the west coast of Florida. The first indications were that the spill was going to be contained very quickly, and with that being the case, we really didn't expect the oil to make its way to our coast. But as it continued, and especially with the unsuccessful closing of the well, we realize now that there could be some very serious consequences, not only in Louisiana and along the northern Gulf Coast, but here along Florida as well.
With everything that's happened thus far, though, are we getting a handle on it?
I'm not sure what you mean by a handle on it. Apparently, British Petroleum is not getting a handle on it, and the oil is continuing. And it's very disconcerting that although in their permits for drilling, they said that they could handle a spill much larger than this one, it is obvious that they cannot. One of the most obvious occurrences of an oil spill are the oil slicks on the surface. And I think the federal government and British Petroleum has been doing a good job of trying to contain it and recover as much as they can. One of these situations with this particular type of oil is it's called a light Louisiana crude oil. So unlike the Exxon Valdez, which had a lot of very heavy residual oil, the very black gunky stuff that floats on the surface and gets everything all full of oil and tar, a lot of the components in the light crude oil are things like, you've heard of benzene or naphthalenes, things like that, and actually some gases that are quite soluble in water and also quite volatile. So as they're coming up through the water column, they dissolve in the water. And these chemicals are very toxic. They also are genotoxic, that is, they affect genetics, and they also can cause cancer. What we're apparently finding now is that at the mid-depth, there are plumes of this oil with dispersant floating about with currents that go in different directions than the surface currents. And so at this time, there's concern that a large volume of oil may be at the mid-depth, very toxic oil, and this is something that the research vessels are out now trying to get a handle on what is there, where it is, and just how much of a problem is it going to be. Mote has developed a three-phased program. Phase 1 was pre-oil impact, sample collection, archiving the samples, and then monitoring for the presence of oil. The next phase is, if in fact the oil gets here, then we go into phase 2, which is our post-oil impact analysis of samples and monitoring to discern the extent of the impact. And then phase 3 is the long-term recovery and rehabilitation of the ecosystems that were impacted. Dr. Gary Kirkpatrick in our phytoplankton ecology program is studying red tide primarily, and the red tide, as you know, is the microscopic marine algae. And in order to understand it, we needed to understand how that functions in the community of phytoplankton. There were no sensors that we could stick out there full-time to monitor what was going on, so he invented one. He's also an electrical engineer. And in order to use them adequately, we use what are called autonomous underwater vehicles that are torpedo-like, about 6-7 foot long torpedoes that have these sensors in them, and we put them out in the Gulf, and they go along, and they, every so many hours or minutes, they'll pop to the surface, and by way of satellite or by radio frequency, they radio back to our operations center what information they've obtained, and if we want them to continue on or not. Well, that technology now is being adapted to oil spill response, because we're replacing the phytoplankton detectors with oil detectors, fluorescence detectors, and we now have 2 of our own automated underwater vehicles monitoring out from Sarasota and 1 out from Key West, so that if and when that underwater mass of the oil and oil plus dispersant comes this way, we'll be one of the first responders to be able to detect the presence of it.
Now, is Mote Marine a privately or publicly funded and granted company, or how does that work? Is it affiliated with the government at all?
Mote Marine Laboratory is an independent, not-for-profit research and education organization. Most of the research that I do is funded through grants and contracts that I write proposals and then submit them competitively to places like the National Science Foundation, NOAA, EPA, the State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. So I spend a lot of my time writing proposals and marketing them so that we can get funding to do the research that we do. We also depend on our local memberships and also donations to the laboratory. And right now, the majority of the funding that we're getting to initiate our oil spill response is from donations. And a very large donation we got from the Venice Gulf Coast Community Foundation really got us started. And now others are coming in to help us continue with our response. To the best of our knowledge, no oil has reached this area. And the prognosis is that because the Gulf Loop current, which is about 150 to 200 miles west of our coast, the Gulf Loop current will carry the majority of the oil past the Florida west coast. So the prediction is that there's a very low probability of oil impacting our beaches along this area. However, if we get a major storm, or if this unknown mass of mid-depth oil plume makes its way this way, especially if there's a major storm, then all bets are off. The major concern is with the Florida Keys, because the Gulf Loop current takes the oil right through there, right by there, and then of course it becomes the Gulf Stream, which goes very close to the Atlantic coast, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and those areas, and they could see, particularly if there's tar balls and a lot of floating oil, they could see a lot of oil along those beaches.
Now, we've seen some devastating photos of how the wildlife along the Louisiana coast have been affected in some of the wetlands and some of the marshes. Obviously, it's toxic, but just how dangerous of a situation are we finding is happening with the wildlife as well as some of the marshes and wetlands?
What's happening in Louisiana is extremely hazardous and very devastating. This oil sheen and the oil slick floating on the surface of the water will destroy the marshes. They'll be there for a long time. If they can keep the booms and the various barriers in place to keep the oil out of the marshes, which they're doing in some areas, then that's the best way. Once it gets into a marsh, it's very hard to clean it up.
Now, I'm getting a lot of emails from people wanting to help. They want to do something because it's such a large situation and it's a catastrophe. However, is there a way that people can help? Can they volunteer, cleanup efforts, in what capacity can people help?
As far as volunteering is concerned, in order to do any oil cleanup at all, you have to be certified through a hazmat training. And I would encourage people to get in touch with their local emergency response. For example, Sarasota EOC. They have a place to sign up, and for volunteers, they have the proper training, how people can get trained, the proper protective clothing, that if oil does get here, how they can help clean up the environment, help with birds or turtles that are affected.
Are you being dispatched to other areas in addition to looking at our local beaches?
At this point, our geographic range of concern is from Tampa Bay south to the Florida Keys, and that's where we're trying to focus our efforts. One of the main problems Mote Marine Laboratory and other places like us are having is funding. So if people want to donate, they can go to mote.org and donate money for the oil spill response.